Here is Monteverde Iced Cookie. This is a teal that in the writing sample is a bit lighter than it comes across in the swatch. This gives a very consistent tone as paper changes, with almost no shift in tone at all. It also tends to shade very well, giving bits of character to the writing. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs at acceptable levels. This would give any student a very nice standout ink for their note taking. Being a very interesting teal, I would love to have a bottle of this.
The pen for today is a Lamy All-Star. So now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
An interesting, slightly darker than mid-tone teal on the page, really being brought to life with this bright white paper. No feather, no spread, very nice shading. In almost every word, we can find shading. We don't see shading on the second line. Have is mostly very dark, but that V does get a little bit lighter, and already next to that works its way from a lighter tone to a very dark tone with the Y at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Monteverde makes more than just one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Monteverde.
Here is Monteverde Mango Mousse. Here is Monteverde Purple Rain. Here is Monteverde Midnight Black. Here is Monteverde Strawberry Shortcake.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does shade without any kind of huge problem, but the shading is not always huge. Like number on the first line has very little shading. The B and the R are slightly darker than the rest of the word. Rearrange, you could rearrange those letters going from lighter to darker tones and not still have the word rearrange. Though cleverly, if you left the R on the left side and the E on the right, you would most likely still read it as rearrange. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here the tone is just a little bit lighter and brighter of a teal than it is on the Clairfontaine, likely being affected by the tone of the paper, meaning this ink is slightly translucent. Now, it does not feather, does not spread, does shade almost as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. I think we're still getting a very nice teal tone, just not as nice for me. Looking at the back of the page, you don't have a problem with ghosting. We do see a number of spots that it does get deeper into the paper. It never bleeds through to the page underneath, and it probably doesn't stop most people from writing back here.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Now, it does not feather, does not spread, does shade just as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. It also stands out against this quad rule with no problems at all. And standing out against the quad rule is always a concern to me when it comes to teal and turquoise inks, because many papers, it's not really a blue quad rule, it's slightly not blue towards that turquoise lean. Looking at the back of the page, we have no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more teal or turquoise inks.
Here is Colorverse Gravity Wave. Here is Noodler's Dostoevsky. Here is Sailor Studio 240. Here is Van Diemen's Devil's Kitchen.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here the tone is ever so slightly lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine, flatter as well. Normally things we see with this paper, so very expected in this case. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, does shade almost as well as it does on the Clairfontaine, does stand out against the quad rule, does say that if a student was using this, they are making really good choices in their inks. This looks very nice and makes their notes distinctively their own. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Diamine Orange. Here is Noodler's American Aristocracy. Here is Sailor Bungu Box Armor Black. Here is Bookbinder's Red Spitting Cobra.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is just a little bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. Now, we don't really get feathering. We get less spread than we normally get on the copy paper. I think it's doing a very nice job in what we're seeing. We're still getting shading, such a very interesting tone. This could be good for this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we don't really have a problem when it comes to ghosting. When it comes to getting deep into the page, there's a lot less than we normally get for this paper, so it's being very well behaved on it. I'm going to say that while I wouldn't write back here, since nothing bled through, this is a very good ink to use on this paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The medium flow fine of the Lamy All-Star gives a very interesting tone with some nice spots of shading. Now, off camera, I tried this in a wet medium, and the tone and shading were, well, unaffected. This is a boring, predictable teal from any pen, easily making it a dealer's choice.